Hello, welcome to Portal to Fantasy. I'm Owen and this is Abby. Abby has her own channel, Naked History, which I'll link in the description. Say hi, Abby.
Hi, Abby. No.
Abby is a
Yes.
very
Hello.
complicated AI who, we haven't ironed out all of the problems with yet.
Yes, I've still got a very 2005 sense of humor.
Yeah.
No. So yeah. Hello, I'm Abby. I do have a channel.
Machine
I'm a
learning,
brief.
but for AIs,
Yeah.
that's what we need. Like
Just
for
wait.
humor.
In a year's time, I'm going to be hyper intelligent. You just wait for it. Yeah, I do have a channel. I'm on a slight hiatus at the moment, mainly because I just had no idea what videos to make. But maybe this video will give me an idea. So.
Well, you
Yeah.
said you've been recording a few bits and you've got some ideas. So
I have. So I'm recording some more deeper discussions. That was grammatically incorrect, but that's fine. We're not going to correct ourselves. That's what I will be doing. I'm doing deeper discussions about books, which is my kind of thing. I like to talk about books in depth. Some favorites.
Yeah.
Just recorded a video about Frankenstein the other day. So yeah.
Yeah. What have you been reading lately? Let's start there. What we're going to do today,
Okay.
we'll just catch up on reading, and then we're going to do an update on the book you picked last time as your first big fantasy book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and then we're going to talk about Harry Potter as a fantasy gateway or as a cultural phenomenon. I think that's the other thing we want to talk about today.
Yeah.
So we'll start with, what have you been reading?
So, okay, I've had to get up my Goodreads for you. So, Joseph Andrews / Shyamala, or you could also pronounce it Shyamala, depending on what you're wishing to get from that name. That I read as a follow-on from reading Pamela. Very much enjoyed it. How could I not? It's Henry Fielding, so I have nothing more.
Henry Fielding, author of Tom Jones.
Tom Jones, yeah, and it's so interesting if anybody has read Tom Jones or wants to read it, that Joseph Andrews, in which Fielding is just basically making fun of Samuel Richardson. It's really obvious that he came up with an idea for a really good story while making fun of somebody else's novel, and then decided to really write a different book. So yeah, that's quite interesting to see that, because it's really obvious that that's where he came up with the idea for it. So yeah, so that was fun. Alice in Wonderland, read again.
Yes,
Like to
I
see
think I saw that on your videos. Yeah, you read that before, haven't you?
Yeah, I read that all the time. It was my first favorite book. It was my first book that I just couldn't put down. It is, yeah. And that really pulled me in as a child, and I loved it. But mainly, I loved the language, and I loved the archaisms and all of that. And I still find it wonderful. So, and you can read it so quickly. You can read it in an afternoon. So, it's a great
I
one.
have finished Book of the New Sun, which Abby is saying she might try to start reading soon, which is exciting. It's sci-fi and it's very confusing and strange, and you're not sure what is actually real and whether or not you're reading hallucinations of a character. But and it's never really made clear about lots of stuff, but it's also really moving and powerful, and Gene Wolfe is a really beautiful writer at times. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. I want to read the other books in the solar cycle, but I don't know when I will do that. And I've been reading, so I finished that, and I have been reading Elric, the Sailor on the Seas of Fate, which I'm going to hopefully be talking about soon with our friend Liam, who has a channel as well. But yeah, Elric is interesting. It's kind of early, new wave sci-fi fantasy. It's very intentionally edgy, and it hasn't necessarily aged well in that way. You're like, yes, you are a part of the counterculture. It's not necessarily transcendent literature, but it's quite fun. He's he's an albino with red eye. He's an albino elf with a sword which sucks souls out of people it kills. So you can get the vibe.
Sounds
from
intriguing.
That.
Yeah.
You can get the vibe. So yeah, you picked. We talked about 4 books because you don't like fantasy, generally speaking. You haven't read it really, other than
apart from Harry Potter and Alice. It's interesting. The fantasy books that I have read and enjoyed are all ones that were aimed at children. So I don't know what that says about me. But
I think we know what it says. But we went through 4 books, and you picked Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. We did have a comment on the first episode. Lawrence Goff, I think, said that like he agrees that Dragonflight does have a really weird romance in it, so you should enjoy it. Like on the note of you enjoying weird romances in books. So we'll get you to reading a book about dragons eventually. But you picked Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is
it's a chunky book. Look at that book in your hands.
Pastiche of 19th century literature, but it's also about wizards in the Napoleonic Wars and fairies and things like that. And you picked that because it seemed like it, I guess. Why did you pick it?
So on paper, it sounded like my exact type of thing. You know, I find the concept of magic interesting, and particularly like dark magic. I really find that quite, because I'm quite interested in like Gothic stuff anyway. So that kind of felt Gothic to me, this idea of this kind of Regency era dark magic. I really like that. And then it being a pastiche and using this archaic style of writing, I thought that sounded really great. It's been an interesting journey of reading it, because it's been a lot more of a challenge than I thought it would be, and the magic is not the problem. The fantasy elements aren't the problem for me. So that's where I will begin.
That's interesting, yeah. So you wanted the 19th century pastiche, you like the idea of the themes. You are, did I see you like 350 pages in? It is literally about 1,000 pages long. My edition is 1,006 pages end to end. So.
Yeah, so I'm 350 pages in. In the beginning, I think you saw my Goodreads updates. If you hadn't have recommended it to me and I literally would have given up on like page 80 or something, because it is very dry in places. I think that's what I will say. And I think it's not the fact that it's a pastiche, because actually the archaic language is what had carried me through some of those bits. That I was like, okay, at least there's something interesting here in terms of it being historical in the archaic language and that sort of stuff. Like at least
and would you say, from your experience of reading lots of 18th and 19th century literature, would you say it's like a good pastiche, like an accurate pastiche?
So here I think is what my main issue is with it. If this book was like 300 pages long, it would be a perfectly fine pastiche. And actually, I think would be a great one. Because of the length of this book, I think the author has missed out on having a really powerful narrator, which is almost always the thing that carries a reader through those really long books of that time period.
Or like Tom Jones, or like Vanity Fair.
Right, Vanity Fair, like all of these things. The narrator often is aware themselves of how long the book is, and will seemingly interact with the reader to kind of like encourage them and pull them through and give them hints at what's coming soon, and kind of pull them along through the story. Sometimes you feel like you're being dragged through a story, particularly in Tom Jones, you know, like you're being dragged through it by the narrator. It's a really long book. In this one, it's like the narrator never...
Book of the New Sun, which is about 1,200 pages long, is similar, that you have this Severian, the narrator is an incredibly strong presence in the book.
Right, which I think actually in a super long book, I think that's what's missing from this, because yes, she does go off on so many tangents, which sometimes I'm just like it's clever and it's slightly funny and it's interesting, but also sometimes it's like, oh my God, please just go on with the story, because where is the plot here? There were definitely points where I felt that way, and she was really just like going off. That in itself is a pastiche thing, because that happens so much in these older books where they just go off on a tangent. But the narrator is like aware of that, and they're just like, hey, sorry, we're just going to talk about something completely unrelated for a bit, but you're going to find it interesting if you don't just skip over it and go to this chapter.
Having read Abby's 18th century pastiche, there are moments where she does that. She's like, I've decided to talk about this because I want to, and it's not actually related to me.
Right, and that's not in me anyway, being like, I'm better at but it's just like I've noticed as a reader, there are moments when I need a bit of guidance to be like, how long is this tangent going to go on for? When are we going to get back to the story? And there's a lack of the narrator sewing everything together, and I'm really, really struggling with this quite flat narrator, because the narrator in themselves isn't particularly witty. Sometimes they say things that are a little bit clever, but there's so much of the narrator, way more than anything else, and the dialogue between the characters is interesting, and the plot is so interesting. The plot is so interesting, but she just keeps on going off from the plot, and the narrator just isn't very interesting.
So you kind of like the pastiche at the level of it being like a nice appreciation of language, but as a kind of aesthetic, at a kind of structural level, that hasn't worked for you as much. Is that what I'm getting?
Yeah, I think it has taken it's taken the aesthetics of a 19th century or later 18th century book, but it hasn't, it hasn't got that like structural integrity. And I think books of that time period get a really bad rap for being extremely slow paced and poorly structured, but actually I don't think that's always the case. And I think it's almost like this modern problem of the narrator not inserting themselves enough into the story, which is what you kind of need on these long stories that go off on tangents. It's kind of like, you know, when you're speaking to somebody and they go off and talk about this and that, and if the person who's doing that is doing it in like a monotone and they're not saying anything in a way that's engaging, it's hard to follow that, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got a real character who's performing something, you kind of don't care when they go off on all these tangents.
Yeah, I think there's probably a degree that formalization of the narrator, I think, would be really interesting to trace in the history of the novel, and the idea that the third person omniscient but also neutral voice becomes like the most common way that books are narrated. Which I guess is kind of what you're pointing at here, is that like it's third person, basically omniscient, basically kind of neutral on the subject, rather than like rather than having the touch of the writer. And that's the thing that maybe those early novels partly have, because you don't have any rules. You just have basically, you have two men who are actually really similar, as in Fielding and Richardson, who share loads of opinions but hate each other and think they disagree.
Right, and they like make jabs at each other in their novels, you know.
Yeah, and so it's there's a frenemy thing there, isn't there?
Yeah, and even Jane Austen does this, you know. I think is it called like free indirect speech or something like that? Like, I don't know the actual term for it, but there's like a term for that kind of narration where it seems like it's third person, but then sometimes you can see that the author is just like pushing themselves in to say something just because they want to.
You get explicit examples of that in, we briefly talked about this before, didn't we? Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, where there's the thing where they're like, I'm a lady who has actually gone to this village and I know these people, but it's mostly a third person narration. But whenever there's a reason to, the author, as in the implied author, gets inserted into the story. And it's an interesting device because it's plainly in that tradition, but it's very explicit that there is a narrator who knows everyone involved, who goes and visits because her father knows people there, I think, or something like that. It's not quite Stephen. It's not kind of the thing where the author ends up being a major part of the story, as in a famous mystery novel, which I will not name because that would spoil the mystery novel. But yeah, like or like some Italo Calvino story, Once on a Winter's Morning. What's that called? That book, like where you have the first person narrator is kind of the third person narrator, but suddenly all the stuff is about them. That's also a device. But the fantasy element of Strange Mr Norrell, like, what about that?
So interesting, and I'm just like, I think the reason why I'm getting through it so quickly now, so you saw I was really struggling to get into it first, and I've been getting through it much more quickly over the past few days, is because I like desperately want to know what is going on with this a kind of mysterious dark magic that's going on, particularly with this kind of like young, what's her name? Is it Lady Paul? I can't remember what her name is. But the young wife, basically, who is the one who's like revived from the dead very early on in the book. And I find I'm finding it so interesting. And I'm loving that kind of like gothicness to it, right? It kind of reminds me of Dracula in some ways, this kind of mysterious man who seems to be almost like draining the life from people.
Yeah.
Seemingly for his own benefit, you know. It kind of has this like Dracula feel to it, but kind of through magic.
Novel, by the way. Dracula's a very good book. A book you might enjoy if you want 19th century pastiche is specifically of vampire fiction, especially around Dracula, is Anno Dracula by Kim Newman. There's a series, but Anno Dracula was originally published on its own, and it was the only one for a while. But I'll show it to you at some point. But basically, Anno Dracula is based on the idea that Dracula wins. But it's not just Dracula, it also brings in lots of other vampire fiction and other gothic horror fiction from the 19th century. Which,
that does sound good.
And so you've got like Mina Harker is a vampire, I think. So like Jonathan Harker and some others die. Mina Harker is a vampire. Jack Stewart is Jack the Ripper, killing vampire prostitutes. And
that actually sounds really up my
Lord
street.
Ruthven is also a vampire like Mina, but is a member of like the cabinet. Is kind of, you know, it's about the kind of the resistance to Dracula in this haunted Jack the Ripper era London.
I read that. So this sort of thing is what I'm really enjoying in the book.
Yeah.
And I'm really like, every time I come across it, I'm like, oh, wow, you know, and even the magic itself, it's kind of so, I don't know, it's almost so camp, the type of magic that they use. It's like really like showy, and it's fun to read about.
We'd call it's a very formalized magic system, we'd say, in fantasy speech. Like, because they're basically scientists, but they're scientists who like have to do very specific things in their experiments to get the magic to work, I guess, is a way to describe it.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, and it feels like within your grasp of understanding. It's not like saying all of these crazy things that mean nothing to me. It's kind of like, as much as I understand science that I don't understand personally, I kind of feel like I can understand this magic. Do you know what I mean? No, I don't know exactly how it works, but I kind of get the general gist of what they're doing and how they're reaching, you know, these things. So that I'm finding really, really interesting, and I just wish it wasn't taking so long to get to those parts, basically.
Well, you are in book 2, aren't you? We'll move on to, because I guess we'll do a more deep thematic dive and stuff next time, in a few weeks. But you are now like fairly deep into volume 2, aren't you? You finally you were annoyed. I remember one time you're like, I don't even know, Jonathan Strange hasn't even turned up, I think was your complaint at one point.
So annoying. I was just like, what? I think because the first few chapters just follow characters who now at this point in the book are kind of like peripheral characters, and it's like, well, why would you start a book with people who aren't central characters? It just is beyond me. I don't understand why you would do that.
It's an interesting device, it's obviously an intentional device, that you are meant to be rediscovering magic like these historical magicians, I guess.
Yeah. I do find myself kind of mentally screaming like, oh my goodness, please get to the point. Where are we? And I think that I think I've seen a lot of reviews of this book. They just said like it shouldn't have been this long. There was no need for it to be this long. And I think actually, I think it's fine, because like you said to me when we spoke last time about it, there is a lot of deep characterization, and the main characters are becoming really complex people, and not necessarily likable people, which I actually think is more interesting to read people who aren't particularly likable. And I think that's really, really interesting. But it's just that like it's not sewn together very well. That's what I would say. Is that
basically you're mostly frustrated at a structural problem rather than a writing or character problem. You're like, it just doesn't.
I think it's well written. It's just poorly structured. I think that's what I would say. And I think the problem is that then I'm not ever getting sucked into the book. I've never at any point while reading this thought like, oh, I can't put this down, or I can't wait to read this again, or oh, I need to read another chapter. It's kind of like, oh, I can pick this up and put it down, and it's interesting, and I know that I'll find something interesting. But also I don't feel like I have this huge pull to read more of it. Do you know what I mean? That's how I feel.
I know what you mean. I definitely read books that I'm like, I don't hate this book. Basically, it's you don't hate it, but you don't love it. Maybe you like it, but you don't love it. Whereas, once I think that there's a particular moment where you click on a book, you know, and you can't. So, Book of the New Sun, I was like, I was finishing my PhD corrections last week, and I was like, I'm just going to spend probably hours finishing this book, and I don't have this time, but I just have to finish this book.
Right.
I
think it's because that's almost like an addictive feeling when you're reading a book, that then to compare it when you're reading books that just don't compare in that way, it's easy to think, oh, then this has no value. That's not the case, though.
Yeah, there's a spectrum, and there's a spectrum. We should talk about Harry Potter, because that was
Yes.
the one big fantasy series you've read. I think you said was like one of your favourite series or sets of books ever. Very formative for you in literary terms. Is Harry Potter. So it is fantasy, and it's quite serious fantasy in terms of all of its fantasy. But at the same time, that your observation was that had never led you to want to read any other fantasy, really. And I think we were just mulling over Harry Potter as a cultural phenomenon, and is it as a reading gateway, as a fantasy gateway, and as a kind of cultural artifact, I guess.
So
I
actually even have my
yes, you've got
my Slytherin there.
As an adult woman and wife and mother, you went and bought a bear.
Went to build a bear.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm actually not a Slytherin. I'm a Ravenclaw, but I want
everyone to know that this channel doesn't approbate this kind of obsession with Harry Potter. We look down on it, but don't say anything nasty in the comments.
What can I say?
Yeah. So that's it. It's really culturally definitional for a whole generation of readers, isn't it? That jokes aside, the reason like, oh, I'm jokingly they say, oh, I say that. Some people are like, I really am a Ravenclaw, and you're like, no, you're not. You're a 31-year-old woman.
Which is like, that's how I identify, is as a Ravenclaw. So
exactly.
I both I was sorted into Ravenclaw, and I also self-identify as a Ravenclaw.
Yes, as a Ravenclaw.
So
that's the thing. It is a massive cultural artifact where people jokingly or not jokingly really do see themselves as the world is part of their life, the story of the characters are part of their life, and it brings a lot of like emotion to people when in various areas Harry Potter comes up. So I guess, what's your thoughts on that? On it as a cultural phenomenon, on it as a reading gateway, as a fantasy gateway?
Yeah. I mean, interesting that I never read these books as a child. I never read them. Wasn't allowed to. Interestingly, we'll get into that another day. But yeah, I never read the Harry Potter books. I never watched the films until I was like in my late teens. So I missed it's not like it's a point of nostalgia with me where I'm like trying to regress to my childhood, because I didn't really ever I was never exposed to Harry Potter until I was already past the point when all of my friends had read all the books, and I think like the last couple of films were coming out or something, and I just kind of like started watching them with friends, and then I went to go see the last couple of films in the cinema because I was like old enough by then to just go and do as I pleased. So yeah, I missed that. So it's not like this trying to cling to my childhood through fiction. I actually read them. I read all of the books pretty close together the year that my son was born, because I had like Kindle Unlimited, and my son, when he did eventually sleep, would only sleep on me, so I couldn't really do anything else, and I got sick of watching TV all day. So I was like, oh, do you know what? I'll just read the Harry Potter books, because I never read them, and I love them, and I don't think they're the best written things that I've ever come across.
It's that as a teen you watched the films, and in your mid-20s you read the books. That's basically your so in that sense, you're not someone who is like, oh well, they were the only books I ever read as a child or something. It is actually that like they're adult reading that you really liked, but you don't. But it's not a reading gateway for you. It's very much you liked reading anyway, and then you.
Yeah, I think I don't know what it was about them, but it's like you do. I think it is like a form of escapism, which I suppose is in a sense what people love so much about fantasy, is this very real sense of escapism. I suppose that's what reading books is on some level always about. However, I think with fantasy, it's just much more of an escape, because you're literally going to somewhere completely different.
Fiction is asking you, like saying, to step out of yourself and go somewhere else and explore other ideas. In fact, I think we call it speculative fiction because, well, I mean, it speculates, but in the sense that it creates these other worlds that could be. And I guess that's something where we're less aware when we read like an A.S. Byatt novel, that's what's happening when she writes about two English literature researchers in the 1980s. She is creating another world, but we're less aware of it being another world. Whereas when we read fantasy, we're like, that's this other place I could go. Basically, no one wants to go to the University of Nottingham in the 80s. Whereas
Whereas Hogwarts.
Whereas Hogwarts is that And it is something I read them as a teen. I read the first 4 in 4 days when Goblet of Fire was coming out in the cinema, like before that. And I read the first 4 at that point. And I think it's when Goblet of Fire was coming out, maybe before, maybe after. But no, it was when Goblet of Fire, the book came out. I read all 4. So yeah. And I really enjoyed them. So early, mid-noughties, I don't know when. But I wasn't a kid, and they weren't the first fantasy fiction I'd read. They weren't the first fiction I'd read. They've never, in that sense, they've never been massively central or definition of my reading. But I've read them a couple of times, and I think they are basically, one thing about Rowling is that she's an incredible page turner. She writes incredible, like, you just want to keep going and find out more because it's easy to read. She's very good at teasing mysteries. I did a video about genre, and when you realize these are school novels and kid detective novels as much as they are fantasy novels, you maybe,
and they're quite dark in places. Yeah. I think part of me instinctively want to be like, oh, it's nice because you can kind of like regress through these novels, but actually the things that they're facing are quite dark and horrible things.
Absolutely.
And it's not like this safe place that you're escaping to. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You're escaping to this kind of like horrible dark place where actually the children aren't safe. And
it reminds me of the Chesterton point about how children don't need to be taught about the existence of dragons. Children know dragons exist. They need to be taught that dragons can be beaten. And I think that's something where the frisson of danger and of darkness is something kids cope with. Yeah, they shouldn't be watching, Pulp Fiction, but at the same time, younger kids can deal with and by that I mean up to your teenage years, but particularly before that, can deal with a degree of darkness if I guess that's something that it's something where you want heroes who win, who solve these things. I think that's the thing Harry Potter does well, is set up real stakes for characters who you may or may not care about. I don't think the central character is necessarily amazing in it. They're not character books, really, are they?
No.
In that sense, you're a character reader, so the fact they're not character books is interesting.
It's so interesting that it's one of the few books where the action and plot development was like a huge part of the enjoyment for me, whereas normally that's like plays second fiddle to the characterization. And as you know, Clarissa is my favorite book, which is very nearly plotless. So the fact, and that's so long, and it's just all about developing the characters involved.
Yeah.
I'd say like I don't know, maybe this is just my girl bias, but I feel like Hermione for me seems to be the most complex character in terms of how she is emotionally developed. I think because she sometimes gets a real like bee in her bonnet about doing things that are really objectively good, but sometimes she goes about it in a way that is quite not the most constructive way, and you can see her,
I maybe distinguish characterization. I think in Harry Potter is fine. By that I mean I have a picture of Harry in my head. I don't think he's a blank slate,
right,
but I think in terms of character arcs, I don't know how often you'd look at a character and be like, apart from Dumbledore and literally someone like Draco, but like how many of them really develop or are different by the end of their appearances from the start? Basically none of them.
And like, sometimes like Harry seems to make quite random choices that don't always seem to align with how you thought his character. Sometimes they just do things that seem to have been put in just for the sake of drama rather than actually being consistent.
There's lots of conflict in the Harry Potter books, and it's interesting because it's one of the ways in which they're detective stories and they're school books, and I guess maybe it's a feature of them being school books that has that degree of like there has to be tension between these kids. Maybe it's the degree to which they are kind of sub-epic fantasy, but like it doesn't necessarily feel needful because a lot of what you're enjoying is them famous fiving. The first 4 books particularly.
Yeah.
A lot of what you enjoy is the famous fiving, and so the tension between them is dumb. But I think that's not what you enjoy there. No one goes to Harry Potter being like, and this is the funny thing about people identifying with characters in Harry Potter, particularly girls identifying with Hermione, is that it's just not like, it's not at all a strong feature of the books that anyone will remember afterward. But it's something where I guess we see them as our audience surrogates, don't we? Those characters, the three kids especially.
Right, and just being pulled into this, just the whole world in itself, I think it's one of the few times when I haven't resented an author for the length of that. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think in like The Goblet of Fire, when we're getting into like this really long description of a field, I was like, come on girl, like, you know, let's move on here. But I think like so much of the stuff is just so interesting because it's not, you're just visiting an entirely different world and things are happening.
I think it's interesting. It's one of those funny things that Rowling is a genuinely able inventor of things. It's plain that she doesn't always enjoy the things she invents. The infamous Quidditch stuff, where she ended up being like, she hated Quidditch and didn't want to put it in books, but like it was an important part of the world that people liked, or so the rumor goes. Tangent. Great Christopher Plummer story. A work colleague of mine once told me he worked in BBC public relations and was going to an event where Christopher Plummer from The Sound of Music and Star Trek 6 was, and someone said to him, look, you know, Chris is going to be here, don't talk about Sound of Music. He hates talking about it. Everyone's constantly telling him about, you know, saying, ooh, tell me about what it was like to be in The Sound of Music. And so this guy, my colleague, was like, okay. And he turns up and he goes in to hear Christopher Plummer on the piano playing Edelweiss. So yeah, maybe J.K. Rowling loves Quidditch. I don't know. But
yeah, maybe it's just an urban myth or something.
Yeah, but there's a degree to which I'm not sure she's super committed to like all the details of her world building. She kind of, it's one of the things about the Pottermore era of just making up random stuff. Is that I don't know.
Yeah, or when she used to just like tweet like retrospective things.
By the way,
Ron
was always a Skrull from the Fantastic Four. He was an alien preparing the invasion of Earth. This is canon.
Yeah, that's so interesting that in this age of author, that's something that can happen. You know, that you can just retrospectively be like, oh,
issues of canonicity and our idea of literature. I'm a stick in the mud and believe that canonicity is a useful measure in literary terms, but it's interesting that when you apply it to Harry Potter, it's not really clear what that would mean. Like, because did Fantastic Beasts count as canon?
Right. And then the reading experience of people who read these books when they first came out, in comparison to now, you're reading them with all this, like, you know, this added information about these characters that isn't in the books.
And they are now classic fantasy. They're now something from the late 90s, the first, as in they are like 25 years old. That's not super classic. You know what I mean? It's this thing where they're now old. So if you're 11 reading them, all of them were published before you were born, possibly, or maybe just as you were born. And so it's a very different experience. And I don't know if that you'll see that phenomenon, that side of the phenomenon die out. I think the books will last as fun kids detective fantasy, but I don't know if that side of the phenomenon can continue. Whereas Lord of the Rings continues to be definitional. That was the point actually we discussed, wasn't it? That Harry Potter is, to lots of people, what to some people Lord of the Rings is. It is a definitional kind of like fantasy book, definitional book that is a significant part of who they are. And I guess that's the thing, you didn't read them as a kid, so it's not about that. But they're a big part of your reading life. And I guess
maybe that's also, you know, when there is this I don't want to say the word like fandom, but these huge groups of people that are really explicitly interested in the exact same book as you, or the same books as you, and they feel the same passion about it as you, then it's kind of easier to feel it as part of your identity.
Yes,
you know, being a fan of those books.
Reinforced, yeah. And I guess it's something where like you love the world, you want to be in the world. The classic thing of like kids wanting the letter from Hogwarts. I would say seeing like 40-year-old people, like men and women, being like, "Oh, I miss my letter from Hogwarts," does feel a bit like a cry for help.
Just me at the King's Cross Harry Potter shop, just like choosing a wand, you know.
But exactly, this thing that it's something where you want to go to Hogwarts, you want to escape, and maybe there's some other cultural stuff there about escapism, but like you want to go there, you can identify with these kids, even if you're in your 20s, you can see them as your portal into fantasy. Read the title of our podcast. And you can share it with other people, are all reinforcing elements that make it definitional. Whereas like Book of the New Sun it has a really strong community, but it's not a massive community. It has people who make really deep podcasts, but it's not a massive community. And I think it's interesting that like no one is like, man, I identify as a member of the Torturers Guild, and someone else is like, no, I identify as a Kakagen. Like,
right. And you all have your Build-A-Bear and your T-shirt.
And, people have Build-A-Bear with Severian from. No one does that, despite the fact they are better books, basically, by most measures, not all, but by most measures. They are much kind of more coherent and deep dive books, but because it doesn't share all those elements of it's an escape into a world you want to go to. It's a shared experience. I think one thing is that you've got to give Rowling credit for is how accessible she makes all this crazy fun stuff. What we should finish maybe here, because we'll pick this up. We can pick this kind of stuff up in future, but like you were saying, you didn't see Harry Potter as a portal to fantasy for you. It was fantasy you love, but it did not make you in the, like, what's 5 years ago, well, 3, 4, 5 years ago and 15 years ago, make you want to read anything else that was fantastic?
No,
Why? Why would you say that?
For me, it was like it was that thing in itself that I enjoyed. Do you know what I mean? It was that world. I didn't want to go to a different one, and it's maybe just because there was something special about that I thought, well, I'm not going to find that somewhere else, so I'll just read those again.
You didn't like speculative fiction. You liked the world of Hogswalk and Hogsmeade, and
and also there's this like intergenerational part to it, where it's like then it's like it kind of like connects people of different ages, because there are people older than myself who really like Harry Potter fanatics, and then there are kids who are like just starting secondary school who are like loving Harry Potter.
Again, the fact it's a cultural phenomenon in a way that potentially better inverted commas books are not cultural phenomena, whereas this is a cultural phenomenon. And so I guess that's the point about canonicity, isn't it? That canon is something we share. And it means it transcends the boundaries of the fiction itself, and so in that sense, it's not just that not just were you most interested in the world of Hogwarts, but also it's something which you share culturally. Which Lord of the Rings, I guess you would, but Book of the New Sun, Dune, which you obviously love. Dune is a classic, but it's nowhere near as culturally kind of widespread.
Literally until this year, I'd never even heard of it. So it's not like, you go to an airport and there's a Dune shop where you can buy.
I guess there probably will be like Dune shelves now because of the film, but yeah, exactly. It's not as important. And so Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell, very successful, won the Whitbread Prize. No one's like, man, I'm a Jonathan Strange. You're a Mr Norrell. Yeah. You are such a Mr Norrell, by the way.
Right. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. But yeah, exactly. So I guess maybe that's natural that people who would, but then on the other hand, you are now getting into speculative fiction, so you always had that interest in sci-fi and fantasy latent in yourself.
Yeah, I think it's always been there. I think maybe part of the reason why I decided to pick up Harry Potter in the first place is because like nearly all of my friends had read them, and it's then like I would have so many people to talk to about these things.
So that helped.
I can just text my. Yeah, it was just like I already knew that there would be loads of people who I could chat to these books about, even if they weren't reading them at the same time as me. There's always going to be people who I know who are interested in these and who would want to chat about them. And there are so few books like that where even amongst your not bookish friends, a good half of them will have read these books and have an opinion on them. That so rarely happens with things, apart from like every once in a while a book comes out that like even people who don't read books read, like when everybody at my workplace was reading 50 Shades of Grey on their lunch break.
Yeah.
But again, like a cultural phenomenon where people are all talking about it, so then other people want to read it so that then they can get involved. Except this has a lot more longevity to it and is let's just not talk about 50 Shades of Grey. So.
William says in the comments that he identifies as the auteur. We should have we should make a Build-A-Bear for Book of the New Sun and have different. Once you've read it and you're into the madness of this kind of insane person literally an insane person writing a book, basically you writing your book. We'll have our own kind of, we'll have scarves and torturers' implements. Okay, so
why not?
Yeah, Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that idea of canonicity getting you over the hump of reading fantasy, which you didn't typically think you would want to read necessarily, is interesting. The same as Alice in Wonderland. People read stuff that is culturally approved. It's one reason why we cannot dispense with canonicity, put it that way. Not because it's always right, but because if we didn't have it, we'd reinvent it with a different set of things, because it's what becomes culturally acceptable.
And the same with like Jane Austen and stuff. The reason why I ended up reading Jane Austen was because her work has been so loved by so many people that I was already exposed to this love of her work before I'd even read it myself.
Yeah.
You know, this passion that people have for an author is like infectious, you know.
Yes. And so if you're bookish and if you know lots of booky people, you hear about other books you are excited about. And you'll find this on BookTube. Like, people will talk about series that like 20,000 people have read, but there's so many people on BookTube are so excited about, which is a force multiplier for that book. Whereas, obviously other books don't get that. But yeah, maybe the other comparison, and we'll have, I know you said you do want to read it. Maybe this is a 2023 project, but like Lord of the Rings would definitely be.
Maybe I could do the audio book of that. I don't know if that would.
So next time you will have finished Jonathan Strange. I guess we're recording 2 weeks or something in April. Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell, and we'll see what you think about it.
I might reread the first Harry Potter as well, just to kind of like
maybe that'd be fun. See if you now are like, I'm so far above this.
Well, the thing is, I had it on my Kindle because I still just have it on there, and I like looked at the first page of the day and I was like, it so quickly sucks me in, because this is the thing about JK, that narration though, like it's so, I don't know if it's because it was designed for children, but it's like so engaging.
Incredibly skilled narrator. I think that's something, maybe one of the biggest skills or gifts she has is being able to engage the audience at the narrative level rather than at the content level. The content struggles sometimes where you're like, it doesn't make any sense. The characters that aren't doing anything, but you're always dragged along like your 18th century rambling narrators on 1,000-page books who nonetheless keep you excited. So we'll talk about that.
The narrator is so engaging. Yeah.
We'll finish Strange and Norrell. We'll talk about Harry Potter if there's anything else, and maybe you'll have started Book of the New Sun. Who knows? Given that's what you're talking about.
I would really, because you seem to, again, it's this like passion inspires passion, because you have so much to say about it. Now I feel like maybe I'm going to read it and have a lot to say about it, and then I'll have someone to talk to. One of these podcasts. People have, like, there are many podcasts for Book of the New Sun where people analyze each chapter for 2 hours, and one day we'll be doing that. If only somebody could join me to do podcasts about Clarissa. I would love that, but I don't think there are enough fans of that book as much as I try to evangelize.
Well, but hey, your passion will make other people read it. So we'll leave it there, and we will be back in a couple of weeks. Thanks, people, for watching, and tell us what you think about Harry Potter, what you think about Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell, and I guess canonicity. What books do people read even though they'd never read anything else like it? I think that'd be a really interesting sample. What books does everyone read theoretically, but would never read anything like it? So I've been Owen, this has been Abby, and this has been Portal to Fantasy, and we'll see you next time.